At my father's retirement gala, I wasn't seated with the family. I wasn't even on the guest list. The woman at the registration table looked up from her tablet with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her voice was careful. Too careful. "I'm sorry, miss." "Dr. Harper Wells," I said, gently emphasizing doctor without sounding defensive. I knew how this worked. She tapped something, frowned, then turned the screen toward me. "I've got Ambassador Richard Wells, his wife, Elaine, their son Connor, and a +1 under his name. But, no Harper." I nodded slowly. "Of course not." She blinked, confused by my lack of protest. "It's fine," I said calmly. "I'll sit wherever there's room." Before she could respond, a familiar voice rang out behind me. "Oh, Harper?" my father called across the foyer in that performative baritone of his. "Don't worry about it. She's not with the family table anyway." I turned my head slightly. He stood in full diplomatic tuxedo glory, black bow tie, polished shoes, a bourbon in hand, surrounded by a semicircle of his colleagues, aides, and, of course, my brother Connor. "She's why this family is embarrassing," he added with a smirk, loud enough to earn a ripple of forced laughter from the group. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't let the smile on my face falter, though I could feel the heat creeping up my neck. My mother, elegant in navy chiffon, was adjusting her pearl bracelet and avoiding eye contact. She knew. She always knew. But she never said a word. Connor gave a lazy chuckle. His fiancée, draped in couture and artifice, leaned closer to whisper something that made him laugh even harder. I stood there for a moment longer, the marble floor beneath me colder than it should have been, the chandelier above casting flickering patterns on the polished walls like the room itself couldn't decide what to reflect. "Are you sure you're okay?" the woman at the desk asked gently. I gave her the same reassuring smile I'd given dozens of people in war zones and crisis tents and refugee camps. "Of course, no worries." Because I had expected this, because this was routine, because they had always made sure I knew I didn't belong, and yet as I walked slowly into the ballroom, past tall white floral centerpieces, past the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of jazz played by a string quartet, I couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever look back on this night and see the irony, because someone else was here tonight, someone who knew what I'd done. Someone who remembered what my family refused to acknowledge. I spotted an empty chair at the far edge of the room, tucked beside a curtain and partially hidden behind a towering floral arrangement. Perfect. Out of the way. Forgotten, just like always. I sat down and crossed my ankles carefully, adjusting the hem of my simple black dress. No sequins, no sparkle, just fabric and function. My eyes scanned the room. My father stood by the main table now, surrounded by senators, foreign service dignitaries, and old allies from his time stationed abroad. His voice carried, as always. He was telling a story about the importance of legacy and gesturing dramatically with his glass. He loved being celebrated. He loved being the hero. He loved the narrative where Connor was the golden son in finance, and I was the missing piece. The puzzle that never quite fit, the wandering daughter who disappeared into war zones and emergency zones and never brought home a husband or a title they could display. They never asked why. They never asked where I went. They never asked what I did when I disappeared for months at a time. They were more comfortable not knowing. They preferred the fiction that I was lost, aimless, quietly disappointing, but they didn't know what was about to happen. They didn't know who had just walked into the room. I saw her before they did. Ambassador Nadia El-Khouri, stepping through the side entrance with the ease of someone used to commanding attention without asking for it. And beside her, walking slightly behind, was Layla El-Khouri, the girl whose hand I'd held as she bled through the back seat of a smuggled medical van. The girl I'd carried through a razor-wired checkpoint in the middle of the night with gunfire in the distance and no guarantee of survival. The girl whose life I had saved. They were here, and the truth I had kept quiet for so long. It was walking into the room wearing a silk gown and a grateful smile. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and folded my hands in my lap. Let them think they won again. For now, because the story they thought they were telling tonight, it was about to change. There's a particular kind of silence that lives in childhood. Not the comfortable quiet of bedtime stories or falling asleep to the sound of rain, but the loud silence, the kind that fills the air when someone looks right through you and speaks around your name. That was my silence. I grew up in the shadow of polished shoes and polished narratives. My father, Richard Wells, wasn't just a diplomat. He was the diplomat. Fluent in 3 languages, always immaculately dressed, always the most commanding voice in the room. My mother, Elaine, played her part too. A graceful wife, quick with small talk, born to host fundraisers and remember names. And then there was Connor, 2 years younger, with a square jaw and perfect hair, and the kind of confidence that grows in boys who've never once been told no. And me? I was the quiet one, the bookish one, the strange one. I didn't throw tantrums or dye my hair or skip school. I just disappeared into corners. I'd read while the others talked. I asked too many questions at dinner. I corrected people when they misquoted facts. That alone was apparently enough to be labeled a problem. One memory always rises to the top, uninvited and sharp around the edges. It was a summer Sunday. I was 12. My science fair project, a soil decontamination filtration system I'd built from scratch, had just won first place at the national level. My teacher told me it had real application potential for water-scarce areas. I came home bursting with pride, clutching my certificate and medal. I walked into the living room to find my father in his favorite armchair, reading The Economist. He barely looked up. "Dad?" I said quietly, almost afraid to interrupt. "I won." He grunted, still skimming the article. "I placed first. They said my design could be used in—" "That's good, Harper," he said absently, flipping the page. "Did you take your shoes off before walking in?" I hadn't. That was the end of the conversation. I stood there, holding the weight of my achievement like it might crumble in my hands. My mother walked by moments later and offered me a soft smile, but she didn't stop. She was late for a brunch. I didn't mention the medal again. By the following weekend, Connor had scored 2 goals in a youth league soccer match, and the entire house exploded in celebration. He got a cake, balloons, a new pair of cleats. That night, I placed the medal in a shoebox under my bed, next to a copy of Watership Down and a dried-out daisy I'd kept from a class trip. That box became my museum of muted triumphs. By the time I was 16, I had learned to measure my words like currency, only spending them where they might be noticed. I learned that I could either fit into the family script or quietly fade from it. I chose to fade. I got good grades. I earned scholarships. I left home the day after high school graduation and never looked back. When I told them I was going to med school, they smiled and nodded. Maybe now she'll become something useful, my father had said to my mother over the dinner table, right in front of me. She responded with a tight-lipped smile and offered me more mashed potatoes. I wasn't even surprised. It wasn't until I started traveling for clinical rotations, when I saw what cholera looked like in real time, what war did to bones and minds, what it meant to hold pressure on a wound while hearing distant explosions, that I felt something shift inside me. I had found a kind of purpose they couldn't understand, and that made it even easier for them to ignore it. They told their friends I was working in global health as if I spent my days handing out pamphlets on hand washing. They never asked about the nights I didn't sleep, the surgeries I performed in generator-lit tents, or the times I thought I wouldn't make it out. They preferred their fiction. The neat family story. Connor, the financial analyst with 3 kids and a mortgage. Harper, the black sheep who never settled down. The last time I was invited to a formal family function, before tonight, was 3 years ago. Connor's engagement party. It was at a country club near Chesapeake Bay. Everyone wore pastels. There was a string quartet playing Coldplay like it was Mozart. At some point, a relative I barely knew asked what I'd been doing lately. Before I could answer, my father cut in with a dry chuckle and said, "She's working on her PhD in something global, saving villages one spreadsheet at a time." Laughter followed. I smiled tightly. That night, I drove back to D.C. in silence, windows down, letting the cold air erase the noise of their laughter. I didn't go home for Christmas after that. They didn't ask why. Now, at 34, I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what I've done. I don't need their applause. But sitting here tonight, on the edge of a ballroom that was never meant to include me, I realized something else. The younger version of me, the one who stood in that living room with a first-place medal clutched to her chest, she needed this moment. She deserved it. And for once, she was going to get it. I can still remember the exact moment I told them what I was going to do with my life. It was a Sunday. I was 24, home for a rare weekend between final rotations in med school and my departure for a global health fellowship in Nairobi. The table was set with pressed linen napkins, 3 different serving spoons for potatoes I never asked for, and wine that cost more than most of my textbooks. My father had invited a couple of his State Department friends over. My mother insisted I come. "It's just dinner," she had said. It never was. Dinner in the Wells household was a performance, not a conversation, but a staging of selective truths. And on that night, I decided, foolishly, that maybe I could be honest, that I could share something about who I really was, what I'd chosen, and they'd meet me halfway. So I waited for the salad plates to be cleared, for the wine to settle, for the ambient chatter to dip into the lull where declarations felt natural. Then I said it, heart thudding in my chest like a drum I couldn't muffle. I've accepted a 2-year placement with Global Response International. I'll be based in East Africa, working on outbreak coordination, trauma relief, and emergency field medicine. I smiled, small but proud. I had worked for it. I had earned it. Nairobi was one of the most competitive placements in the program. My father didn't look up from his roast. He was slicing into the lamb with clinical precision, the knife glinting under the chandelier. "Nairobi?" he repeated flatly. I nodded. "Kenya, the unit focuses on deploying medical personnel within 48 hours of any major disaster. Civil unrest, epidemics, refugee displacement.
The blade had caught. She said people don't like cops anymore. Luke's jaw worked, then stilled. He considered policy, politics, and pain, all the things he had no intention of hanging on a 6-year-old's shoulders. "People like kindness," he said finally. "And your dad had a lot of that. So let's talk about that when you want." Ivy's gaze drifted to the window, where Snow wrote and rewrote the same unpunctuated sentence. "She said wait at the gate," Ivy added, softer now. "That he'd come there first. She said she'd come back." The facts hung in the air like thin ice. Luke resisted the old reflex to promise what he couldn't, that everything would be okay, that mothers do not fail, that the world is a machine with safety rails. Instead, he put the promise where his hands were. "You're safe here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the paperwork. Tonight is for warmed-up toes and a dog who refuses to go anywhere else." Ivy nodded like a soldier accepting terms. She finished the cocoa. The frame rose and fell with her breathing. Ranger shifted closer until his flank touched the quilt. Luke returned to the kitchen and dialed a number that Winter had kept on ice. Martha Hayes, the town's nurse practitioner, who could read a thermometer at the same time, she read a soul. He kept his voice low, factual, a child, frost nip, alert, no acute trauma, stable. Martha promised to come at first light with salve, socks, and the kind of conversation that builds a small, necessary porch between panic and plan. After he hung up, Luke stood at the sink and looked at his reflection in the window. The glass sent back a man with laugh lines that had been demoted to memory, eyes that had watched too many ends and still kept looking for beginnings. Behind him, on the hall floor, Ranger's nails clicked twice, an old dog's code for all is well enough. He turned off the lights one by one until the house wore only what it needed. A nightlight in the hall, the stove's faint orange grin, the snow's patient whispering. In the doorway of the spare room, he stood a moment longer, letting the sight take him. The small figure under the quilt, the frame still in her arms, Ranger curved at her side like a comma. God had placed in the sentence so she could breathe. The winter night hunted at the window, with white teeth it had borrowed from the moon. Inside, in a circle the size of an old quilt, something stubbornly alive kept its heat. "Okay," Luke whispered to the hush, to the old grief that never asked for permission and the new hope that never apologized for arriving. "We'll do this right." Ranger's ear flicked as if he had just been promoted to senior advisor, domestic affairs. Luke nearly smiled. The myth says miracles arrive with trumpets. The truth is they sneak in with damp socks and a picture frame and a dog who refuses to budge. In Pine Brook, in midwinter, that was enough.
Thinking, if they could see me now, would it change anything? But then I remembered. They had the chance to ask. Over and over. And they never did. When I came back to the States last year, I moved into a modest walk-up in D.C., close to the organization's main coordination center. I still deploy when needed, but most of my work now is strategic, building systems, creating rapid response models, and training the next generation of field medics. Still, to my family, I'm the one who travels too much. They don't know about Layla El-Khoury, or the night her convoy was ambushed in a red zone where civilians weren't even supposed to be. They don't know I was there, that I held her pulse in my hand, that I screamed into a radio for emergency extraction while gunfire rained down, that I was told not to intervene, that I did anyway. They don't know she nearly died. They don't know she didn't, because of me. Tonight, she's in this room. And so are they. My father, sipping his bourbon. My mother, rearranging the silverware like the world can be ordered if she tries hard enough. Connor, always a few paces behind the man he wants to impress. And me, still here, still quiet, still unseen, but not for long. It was supposed to be a handoff, just a routine handoff. Coordinates confirmed, check-in cleared, UN-certified vehicles. We weren't even supposed to get out of the cars. I'd been deployed to an extraction zone west of Sidra Falls, a pocket of contested territory between two warring factions. Our team's job was simple: retrieve a high-value civilian and her accompanying aide, then transport them to a fortified airstrip. 15 minutes, in and out, nothing complicated. I didn't even know her name until I saw her. Until the gunfire started. It was late evening, dry heat pressed against my skin, thick with the scent of burnt rubber and diesel. The sky had that copper tint it gets just before sunset, like the day is warning you that it's about to end. Our vehicle pulled up first. I was in the back reviewing our evac route on a tablet when I heard the crack. Sharp, echoing, not celebratory, not warning shots, targeted. A second later, our windshield spidered with impact. Then the driver slumped forward, a dark halo of red soaking into his collar. The team scattered, trained reflexes kicking in, but our convoy had been boxed in. A trap. I reached for the trauma kit, the radio, my flak vest. Everything blurred into a sequence of muscle memory. I was yelling into the comms. "Echo Base, we're compromised. Ambush Zone 3. We need airlift or diversion now." Then I saw her. Through the cracked side window, half hunched behind a concrete barrier, was a girl, maybe 19 or 20. Skinny jeans, blood-soaked scarf, one arm hanging limp at her side, and eyes. Terrified, unblinking eyes. Locked on me. I didn't know who she was yet. I only knew she shouldn't have been. There, not alone, not bleeding, and not without backup. 2 men were with her, one slumped over, clearly gone. The other fired wildly into the air, trying to create cover. I threw open the vehicle door and ran. No flak vest, no helmet, just adrenaline. I crawled, then sprinted, then crawled again, firing 2 rounds from the sidearm I'd barely ever used in the field, not to hit anyone, just to scatter, just to buy time. I reached her just as the man with her collapsed. Shrapnel. Too much blood. "You're okay," I lied, crouching beside her. "You're okay, I've got you." Her voice was small. "My leg. I can't—" I checked. Clean entry, no exit. Femoral artery spared, but barely. She was seconds from shock. I tore open my trauma pack and clamped it. Wrapped it tight. pressed my hand down hard enough to make her scream. "That's good," I said, panting. "Pain means you're still here." I got her name from the dog tag clipped to her backpack. Layla El-Khoury. I recognized the surname immediately. Her mother was one of the most respected ambassadors in the Middle East. If this girl died here, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was an international incident. And we were already on the wrong side of the border. The radio crackled. "Evac denied. Hot zone. Repeat. Air denied. You're on your own." I looked down at her. Sweat slicked her hair to her forehead. Her lips were turning pale. I could have waited. Could have secured a perimeter. Followed protocol. Instead, I hooked my arms beneath her and lifted. She wasn't heavy. She was shaking, trying not to cry. "Where's your team?" I asked between gasps as I ran. "Gone," she whispered. We moved through debris, over fences, around burning tires. My knees scraped raw. My shoulders screamed from the weight. Every 20 feet, I stopped to check her pulse. At one point, she passed out. I didn't have time to panic. We made it to a back road where one of our drivers had managed to push through a barricade. I climbed into the back of the armored vehicle, laid her across my lap, and shouted for saline and morphine. Her pulse was thready, but present. We crossed the extraction threshold 43 minutes after the first shot was fired. She didn't wake up until the next morning. I was still in the mobile unit beside her, hand-cranked monitor ticking beside the cot. When she opened her eyes, I smiled. "You made it," I said softly. She blinked. "You carried me?" I nodded. She reached up with her good hand and grabbed mine. 3 days later, her mother arrived at the medical center, eyes red, face drawn, voice steady, only because it had to be. She didn't say much, just looked at me, then pulled me into an embrace that lasted longer than protocol usually allowed. "She's my only child," she whispered. "Thank you." I didn't say anything back. Didn't know how. It was the first and only time I saw Ambassador El-Khoury until tonight. As I sat at the back of that ballroom, watching her glide across the floor in a navy gown, poised as ever, I felt a strange ache ripple through me. Not fear, not pride, just something unfinished. Then I saw Layla, trailing just a step behind. She looked nothing like the girl I'd carried. Her hair was long now, shiny and curled at the ends. Her arm, once bandaged and lifeless, was moving freely. She smiled as she walked. She was whole, alive. I watched her for a long moment, heart thudding like it had that night in Sidra. They didn't see me. Not yet, but they would. The jazz quartet faded into a slow rendition of something vaguely patriotic, all brass and strings and polished timing. That was the cue. From the stage at the center of the ballroom, a man in a white tuxedo tapped the microphone and smiled like he'd been waiting all evening to feel important. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please take your seats. The formal program will begin in just a few minutes." I didn't move. From my table at the edge of the room, hidden behind one of the floral installations, I had the perfect view. A quiet corner of observation. No one had spoken to me. No one had asked why I was sitting alone, and that suited me just fine. I didn't need to be seen right now. I needed to see. My father stepped up to the stage just as the room hushed. He looked every bit the figure he had worked so hard to become. Straight-backed, square-jawed, with the false humility of a man who believed his own press releases. Applause greeted him like an old friend. Behind him on the projection screen, a photo montage began to play. His years in service, shaking hands with ambassadors, touring earthquake zones with heads of state, accepting plaques and medals and commendations from organizations that had spelled my name wrong on holiday cards for years. I watched as he took the mic, adjusting it with a slight smirk like a man used to being handed a platform. Thank you all," he began. "It's humbling to look back on 4 decades of service. Diplomatic work is never about one person. It's about representing a nation, a legacy, a family." He turned slightly toward our assigned family table. Connor was seated dead center, flanked by his fiancée and my mother, who had dabbed powder on her nose at least twice since sitting down. My empty seat among them remained unacknowledged. My son, Connor, has followed in these footsteps, my father continued, finance and foreign policy, hand in hand, making connections I could have only dreamed of at his age. He smiled as the audience politely clapped. And then, the shift. A pause. A tightening of his jaw. The smirk. And of course, he added with a casual shrug, not everyone chooses that path. Every family has its diversions and its embarrassments. A ripple of laughter. I'm just glad the Wells name still means something out there in the world. Another round of applause, some confused, some performative. And just like that, the room moved on. No one flinched, no one gasped, no one said, "That was cruel." Because in this room, I wasn't anyone. Not yet. To most of them, I didn't exist. But across the ballroom, two people did see me. It started as a shift in the atmosphere, like someone opening a window in a sealed room. Ambassador El-Khoury had just been seated at one of the front tables reserved for distinguished guests. She was only about 20 feet from the stage, close enough to have heard every word of my father's thinly veiled insult. Her eyes were already on me. She had been scanning the room the moment she walked in, and when they landed on me, quiet, back corner, head high, her face didn't change. She didn't gasp. She didn't rush over. She just saw me. And then she smiled. A quiet, knowing, devastating smile. Not pity. Recognition. Her hand moved to Layla's arm and squeezed gently. Layla turned, followed her mother's gaze, and froze. I don't know what I expected. Gratitude, tears, shock. What I got instead was something far simpler, far more powerful. Layla stood. She walked across the floor, past generals and CEOs and old men adjusting their cufflinks. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. She didn't even speak. When she reached me, I stood too. And for a moment, we just looked at each other. Up close, her eyes still held the same softness I remembered from that night in Sidra. The same quiet strength I'd seen through the sweat and the blood and the fear. But now there was something more. Light. She threw her arms around me. I caught her. For a heartbeat, the ballroom ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of her hug and the trembling exhale of relief that passed between us like something sacred. "You look alive," I whispered against her shoulder. "I am," she murmured. "Because of you." She pulled back, eyes shimmering. "We didn't know you'd be here." "Neither did they," I said softly, nodding toward the family table. Layla followed my gaze. Her smile dimmed. "I heard what he said," she whispered. "I've heard worse," I replied with a shrug that was half truth, half armor. "I haven't," she said, "and I've been shot at." We laughed, too quietly for anyone to hear. She squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "I'm used to being invisible," I said. "Tonight's just more of the same." She shook her head. "Number not tonight." And then she walked back across the floor, her steps deliberate. When she returned to her seat, she leaned toward her mother and whispered something. Ambassador El-Khoury looked toward the podium, then back at me. And that's when I knew. Something was coming, something no one in this room was ready for. Except me. There are moments you feel coming before they arrive. You sense the pressure shift in the air. You feel a silence sharpen its teeth. You see the stillness in a person's eyes before they move. I watched Ambassador El-Khoury from across the ballroom, and I knew. She hadn't touched her glass of wine. She hadn't looked back at the podium. She hadn't spoken to anyone at her table except her daughter. Her gaze had returned to me 3 times, once with recognition, once with calculation, and now, resolve. My father, oblivious, had launched into another story. This one about hosting high-level peace talks in Prague. He gestured animatedly, recalling something about late-night negotiations, strategic brilliance, last-minute interventions. He was in his element. The room, once again, belonged to him. He didn't know the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. From the front row, Ambassador El-Khoury rose to her feet, not abruptly. No clinking of silverware or sweeping motion of drama. She simply stood, quietly, confidently, with the grace of someone who knows she's about to tilt the axis of the room without raising her voice. I saw it before anyone else did, but it was Connor who noticed next. He turned his head and blinked at her in confusion. Then his fiancée whispered something. My mother leaned toward my father and tapped his wrist. His voice faltered. Ambassador El-Khoury took a single step toward the stage, and the ballroom changed. It was subtle at first, waiters pausing mid-step, chairs shifting slightly, a low murmur bubbling beneath the quiet. People started turning, not because they were told to, but because they felt it. That rare, unmistakable frequency of power entering motion. The MC, clearly caught off guard, stepped forward to intercept her. Ambassador, I believe the program is... She simply held up one hand, silencing him without a word. Then she turned and faced the audience. Her voice didn't need a microphone. It carried like truth does, clearly, cleanly, with no room for misunderstanding. If you'll allow me a moment, she said, I would like to add something to this evening's program, something that wasn't planned, but should have been. Every head in the room turned toward her. My father's expression tightened, his spine straightened. He recognized the tone. He'd used it himself in press briefings when a narrative was about to slip from his control. Of course, Ambassador, he said, with the performative charm I'd seen so many times. We're honored to hear from you. She inclined her head, then walked to the podium. She didn't rush. She didn't smile. Her heels clicked against the floor like a countdown, and when she reached the microphone, she looked out over the sea of faces. The crowd hushed so completely that even the HVAC vents seemed to fall silent. I want to speak tonight, not just as a diplomat, she began, but as a mother. Already the room shifted again. A different kind of silence took hold, listening silence, the kind reserved for funerals and breaking news. 2 years ago, she said, my daughter was caught in an unspeakable situation in a region most of you have only ever read about in sanitized reports. What happened that night was not supposed to happen. The mission was secure. The plan was perfect. Until it wasn't. Layla lowered her head. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass. Amidst an ambush, a failed convoy, and a comms blackout, there was one person who didn't hesitate. A woman, a field doctor, a specialist who broke protocol to save a life that wasn't part of her assignment. Who carried my daughter, bleeding and unconscious, through a crossfire zone without backup, without guarantee of extraction, without anyone knowing what she had done. She paused. I felt my throat close. She turned slightly toward my father's table. And she did it without expectation, without glory, without ever telling the people she loved. There it was. The edge. The dagger sliding gently between the layers of a carefully constructed world. My father blinked. My mother's mouth was slightly open. Connor had stopped chewing whatever canapé he'd just popped into his mouth. Ambassador El-Khoury looked back at the room. I did not know she would be here tonight, she continued. But I saw her, and I remembered. Now the silence was suffocating. I remembered the woman I met in a dusty tent on the edge of war, the one whose hands were shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion. Who wouldn't let go of my daughter's wrist until her pulse stabilized? Who didn't care who I was or what flag I served, only that Layla made it through the night? Her eyes scanned the crowd, then found me. She is sitting in this room, not at the family table, not in the front row, but she is here. She stepped back from the podium, and I think it's time the room saw her. Then she said my name. Dr. Harper Wells. A long beat, then her voice, warmer now, stronger. Please stand. For a heartbeat, no one moved. My pulse pounded so hard I could hear it in my teeth. My hands were clenched under the table. My knees were locked. My vision narrowed. I could have stayed seated. I could have smiled it off. I could have waved politely and disappeared into the wallpaper, just like always. But I didn't. I rose, slowly, calmly, straight-backed. The room didn't erupt in applause, not yet. But it shifted. Heads turned, faces widened, some whispered, some stared. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. I already knew. For a few seconds, it was just me, standing alone in a room of seated power. The silence wasn't awkward. It was electric. A current, charging the air with something ancient and overdue. I didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't shrink. I simply stood. And then, slowly, one by one, uniformed shoulders straightened, postures corrected. People began to rise. A general from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a senator whose face I recognized from televised hearings, the head of the Humanitarian Logistics Council. Then the applause began. Not wild, not over the top, just steady, controlled, earned. I could see confusion ripple through the crowd like heat off asphalt. People turning to one another, whispering, "Who is she? Did you know? Wells, as in Richard Wells?" I watched from where I stood, unmoving, as every guest, except 3, rose to their feet. My mother, my brother, my father, still seated, still frozen, like marble statues in a museum that had just been declared irrelevant. Their faces told 3 different stories. My mother, disbelief, followed by shame, followed by something quieter, a quiver in her lip. Connor, pale, unreadable, his ego scrambling for a foothold. But my father, his expression was something I'd never seen before. Not disappointment, not even anger, fear. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Like the ground beneath his decades of control had begun to split, like he had just discovered a stranger sitting inside the body of his daughter. From the stage, Ambassador El Khoury stepped forward again. "She won't tell you this herself," she said into the mic, "because people like her rarely do. But allow me to finish what I started." She gestured toward me as I stood. "The woman before you has coordinated evacuation protocols in 6 countries. She's delivered premature babies in disaster zones with no power. She's built field hospitals out of shipping containers. And 2 years ago, she saved my daughter's life in a hostile zone when extraction was denied. She physically carried her, 3 miles to a secured point without backup air support or even a guarantee she'd make it herself." The room stilled again. "She didn't do it for headlines. She didn't do it for medals. She did it because someone needed help. And she ran toward the danger." She paused, eyes scanning the faces before her. That's what courage looks like. That's what legacy looks like. And if there's any embarrassment in this room tonight, it's that a woman like her has ever had to sit in the shadows. The words didn't just land. They detonated. I felt them tear through the carefully cultivated social hierarchy like a slow-burning fuse. Felt the tablecloth pulled off the illusion my father had tried to maintain all his life. That his version of the family was the only version. And now, everyone saw what had been hidden. The ambassador stepped back. I remained standing. And this time, when the applause came, it roared. It rolled through the ballroom in waves, sincere and sustained. Not the polite clapping of obligation. Not the performative appreciation of a gala. But something more primal. Respect, recognition. And from people who'd spent their lives in rooms where power had a very specific look and sound and last name, this was not nothing. It was everything. I sat back down slowly. My knees didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble, but inside I felt something crack open, not a wound, a weight, a quiet, unrelenting ache I'd carried for so long, I forgot it had mass. And now, finally, it was beginning to lift. My eyes didn't wander to my family, not yet. I didn't need their reactions to validate the moment, because this moment, this one was mine. And for the first time, I didn't want their approval. I wanted their discomfort. I felt my phone buzz in my purse. One vibration, then another. No doubt the family group thread was ablaze. My mother texting frantic half-apologies. Connor trying to rationalize what he had just seen. And my father, probably typing, deleting, retyping, and eventually settling for silence. But I didn't reach for it. I didn't even glance down. Instead, I lifted my water glass and took a slow, steady sip. And when I finally let my eyes drift to the family table, all three of them were staring at me. No masks, no performance, just raw, naked confusion. Connor was the first to look away. My mother's hand was over her mouth, and my father, still locked in place, as if he hadn't yet figured out what to say when the narrative had been rewritten without his permission. Good. Let him sit with it. From the stage, the MC cleared his throat and announced the next speaker. But no one really listened. The room had changed. The air had shifted. And the rest of the night, no matter how carefully choreographed, would orbit around the black hole of truth that had just been revealed. I felt Layla's eyes on me from across the room. She smiled and mouthed two simple words, "Thank you." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't revenge. This wasn't justice. This was something rarer. This was clarity. The next speaker on stage, a tech CEO from Austin or maybe Houston, was talking about resilience, something about leadership in times of global instability. But the room wasn't with him, not really. Eyes still drifted toward me, even as he spoke. It was strange. For years, I'd grown used to being invisible, at dinners, at holidays, in my own family. But now I was something else entirely. Something that didn't quite have a name yet. Not a war hero, not a celebrity, not a cautionary tale. Just seen, and not by everyone. My mother hadn't moved since I last looked. One hand still covered her mouth. Her eyes hadn't blinked in what felt like a full minute. She looked less like a woman caught in scandal and more like someone mourning something she had never truly known. Her daughter. The ER. Real one. Connor leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch. He still hadn't applauded, hadn't stood, hadn't smiled. The kind of silence that speaks not out of confusion, but pride wounded too deeply to recover. And my father? My father looked like stone, like he'd been carved mid-thought and someone had forgotten to chisel the rest of him. He didn't clap, he didn't scowl, he didn't speak, he just sat there, like a king who'd been dethroned in the middle of his coronation. "Doctor?" "Wells," someone said softly beside me. I turned to see a woman in a Navy uniform jacket. Air Force, maybe late 40s, polished, precise. "I just wanted to say," she hesitated, then smiled. "That was long overdue." She offered her hand. I shook it. And then she said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes the people who raise us can't fathom the weight we carry, because they never expected us to carry anything at all." I didn't reply. I couldn't. She gave me a respectful nod, then returned to her seat. After that, people kept coming. One by one. A diplomat from South Africa, a nurse who had once served with Doctors Without Borders, a logistics officer from NATO who recognized my name from a case study. Each of them said some variation of the same thing. I read the report. "Your name was in our training. We've used your field hospital design. You saved more than one life that night." It was surreal. The things I'd done, not for applause, not for photos, but because they needed to be done, had lived on in documents, lectures, and briefings around the world, but not around my own dinner table, not in my father's speeches, not in my brother's LinkedIn endorsements, not in my mother's scrapbook of family accomplishments. I caught her eyes again. My mother's. She was blinking now, rapidly, as if trying to stop herself from crying, and then, like she couldn't hold it in anymore. She stood. Not for me, not yet. She didn't come over, she just rose to her feet and walked out of the ballroom, quietly, quickly, head down. Connor didn't follow. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, pretending the glass in his hand held the answer. And still, my father sat frozen. I waited. I gave him time. Surely he would say something, a quiet nod, a forced smile, even a whisper, anything. But he didn't. Not until the next speaker was called. Not until people began to return to their dinners, to their conversations, to their routines. Only then did he rise from his chair, straighten his tie, and step onto the stage again. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the ambassador, didn't mention my name. Instead, he smiled that same polished, carefully worn-out smile he'd used on cameras for decades. "I'd like to thank all our esteemed guests," he began, voice steady. "And of course, the ambassador, for her moving words. Tonight is a celebration of diplomacy, of service, and of resilience. We are honored to be in such noble company." He paused. And for a second, I thought he might crack. Might actually say it. Acknowledge what she had said, what I had done, what he had hidden. But then he continued. "And I'd like to remind us all that in the service of legacy, discretion is sometimes as important as valor." That was it. That was his response. A veiled insult. Disguised as grace, he wasn't proud. He was cornered. And instead of evolving, he did what men like him always did. He erased. The audience clapped politely. No standing ovation this time. No cheers. Just a slow, tired smattering of hands that knew better but stayed silent out of habit. My heart didn't break. It had already done that years ago. What I felt now was different. Freedom. Because that was the moment I understood. He would never give me what I deserved, and I no longer needed him to. I stood again, not for the room, not for applause, but to leave. Layla met me at the exit. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "I'm sorry your family didn't see you sooner." I smiled. They weren't meant to. And with that, I stepped out of the ballroom, the applause of strangers still echoing behind me, louder, more sincere, and far more meaningful than the silence I'd once fought to fill at home. The night air was cool, dry. One of those California evenings where the breeze carries just a whisper of salt, even though the coast is miles away. I stood beneath a street lamp at the edge of the parking lot, heels in hand, the gravel biting into my arches. My feet ached, but it wasn't the shoes. It was the weight of everything I had carried into that ballroom, and everything I refused to carry back out. Across the dark asphalt, engines rumbled, taillights blinked. A few guests stepped into waiting town cars, chattering about the ambassador's speech, the wine selection, the awkward moment when Harper Wells was suddenly, someone. I didn't move. I wasn't done yet. The heavy door behind me creaked open. I didn't turn around, didn't have to. I could feel him before I saw him, that precise, familiar step. Not hurried, not hesitant, just controlled. Always controlled. My father. "Harper," he said flatly. I let the silence stretch. Then, still facing the cars, I replied, "Richard." His steps stopped, just short of me. Not Dad, not Father, not Daddy, like Connor still called him when he wanted something. Richard. He hated it. "You don't have to be like this," he said quietly. I turned then, slowly. He was standing a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, brows drawn just slightly. Not angry, not apologetic, just calculating, like always. "Be like what?" I asked. "Honest?" His jaw ticked. Ambassador El Khoury caught us off guard. That should have been cleared with the program team. "There it is," I muttered, mostly to myself. "Even now, it's about control." He stepped closer. This wasn't the time or place for that kind of drama. It was a diplomatic evening, not a personal one. "But you made it personal," I said, sharper now. "On that stage, when you said, 'Every family has its embarrassments.' You weren't talking about diplomacy, Richard. You were talking about me." A beat of silence. I never said your name. Number you never do. He exhaled through his nose like I was being unreasonable. Like I was the child again, demanding too much, making a scene. You should have told us, he said finally. Told you what? That I dragged Layla through enemy fire? That I ran out of morphine and used my own belt to slow her bleeding? That I didn't radio for help because the comms were down and the backup extraction point was compromised? His eyes dropped. I don't report to you anymore, I said, voice tightening. And I stopped needing your validation years ago. But don't twist the narrative now just because someone you respect more than me said my name into a microphone. He looked up, jaw set. I built this family's name, he said. No, I corrected him. You built your name, then you stapled ours to it. He flinched. For the first time in years, I saw it. His mask crack. You think I didn't try to be proud of you? He said, voice rising slightly. You were always different, unpredictable, never where we needed you to be. No, I was never where you could use me, I said calmly. I needed a daughter who understood optics, reputation, grace, not someone who'd go off playing soldier in some desert, chasing martyrdom. That did it. My heart didn't race, my fists didn't clench, but my voice, cold, steady, cut clean. She's alive, I said. Your goddaughter, your ambassador's only child. Layla El-Khoury is alive because I didn't sit on my hands waiting for orders. She breathes because I didn't care about reputation. He didn't reply, just stood there, still, rigid, exposed. I don't need your praise, I continued. I needed your presence. I needed a father who didn't shrink me to keep his ego intact. A car pulled up to the curb behind me, Layla and her mother in the back seat. El-Khoury saw us, gave a gentle nod. I nodded back. And then I turned to my father one last time. You know what the worst part is? I said. You'll go home and still think this night was about you. You'll rewrite it in your head. Make yourself the victim, the disrespected patriarch. But deep down, you know exactly what happened. He didn't deny it, didn't defend himself. He just looked at me with eyes that finally, held something close to recognition. You were wrong, I added. I'm not the embarrassment. Then I slipped my heels back on, turned and walked away. I didn't flinch when I heard his voice behind me. Harper, wait. I paused, but I didn't turn around. I don't know how to fix this, he said, barely above a whisper. I let the silence hold. Then I said, maybe it's not yours to fix. And I stepped into the night, leaving him and everything he refused to become behind. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove down the coast, windows half open, heels tossed into the passenger seat, my dress bunched awkwardly beneath me. My hair smelled like someone else's perfume. The echo of applause still hummed somewhere inside my ribcage. But louder than that, quieter, heavier, was the silence that came after. That's always how it is. The noise fades, the rush ends. You're left with yourself, the night sky, and all the truths that didn't get said. I stopped at a small overlook just north of Pacifica, where the cliffs cradle the ocean like they've done for centuries. I leaned on the hood of my car, staring into the dark, trying to feel anything. And that's when my phone lit up. Mom. I watched it ring, watched her name pulse against the screen like a heartbeat. She never used to call. She texted, sent updates, forwarded articles about Connor, invitations to family brunches that I was never expected to attend. But now, tonight, after all that silence, she called. I let it ring, then watched it go to voicemail. Not a minute later, another came through, voicemail 0017. I opened it, and for the first time in years, I heard my mother's voice waver. Hi, honey. I just wanted to say I saw you tonight. I really saw you. I didn't know. About Layla, about all of it. Your father never said. I guess I never asked. There was a pause, and then something that sounded like a sob quickly muffled. I'm proud of you. I know I didn't show it. I should have. You've become someone I don't even recognize, but in the best way. Please call me back." She ended it there. 17 seconds. 17 seconds that I'd waited for half a lifetime to hear. But it didn't feel like I thought it would. There was no swell of relief, no weeping catharsis. Just stillness. Growing up, I used to sit on the staircase after bedtime and listen to my parents talk about Connor, about his potential, his future, their dreams for him. His mistakes were misunderstandings. Mine were disappointments. If I won an academic award, it was, well, you always were a bookworm. If I trained to deploy, it was, do you have to be so intense all the time? And if I told them I was tired, that I was worn thin, it was always, well, you made your choices. But that night, finally, I realized something important. Yes, I made my choices, but they made theirs, too. They chose to shrink me, to sideline me, to avoid learning who I really was because it didn't fit the version they wanted to show the world. They had a curated family image to protect. And I didn't fit inside the frame, so I stopped trying. Another voicemail came through. Mom. Again. 112. This time, I didn't hesitate. I tapped play. Hi again. I didn't say enough. I didn't say it right. I'm not good at this. I always thought if I stayed neutral, if I kept the house calm, if I let your father set the tone, things would stay... Okay. I was wrong. Her voice cracked. Do you remember the 5th grade science fair? You came home crying because the judges said your project was too ambitious for your age. Your father said, well, it was overdone. But I saw you, Harper. I saw you stay up 3 nights sketching those schematics. I watched you talk to the librarian like she was a NASA engineer. I even saw you fix the wiring when it shorted out at school. I saw it. I just didn't say anything. I blinked, tried to remember that version of myself, the one who believed big ideas were worth showing up with, even if no one clapped. I let your father shrink you down because it kept the family system running smoothly, but you were never the problem. You were the only one ever strong enough to break the pattern. Silence. A breath. Then one last whisper. You didn't embarrass this family, Harper. You showed us what we could have been. I'm just sorry we weren't brave enough to follow you there. The message ended. I didn't cry, but I didn't delete it either. I saved it. Not because it healed me, not because it erased anything, but because it proved she finally looked, noticed, remembered, regretted, and even if it was too late to build something new, it meant I wasn't invisible all along. At some point, the fog rolled in, slow and deliberate, like even the night wanted to disappear into itself. I sat quietly in the car, phone dim in my hand, headlights off. The grief I used to carry? Gone. Not because they made it right, but because I had stopped letting them write my story. I no longer sit by the phone waiting for my mother to reach out. But that night, I saved her voice. Not for comfort, for confirmation. That I was never the broken one. I was just the one who refused to be silent. As I pulled onto the highway, headlights flaring behind me, I felt a strange sensation I hadn't felt in years. Not grief, not anger, lightness. I had walked into that ballroom as the family's quiet stain, the overlooked, the afterthought. And I walked out a name that meant something. Harper Wells, a woman who had saved lives, carried weight, endured silence, and stood finally, with the world watching. And didn't flinch. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. No public RSVP, no family group chat notification, no Instagram story hint. The scholarship event at Stanford was meant to honor women in service, those who'd done more than their roles asked of them. Quiet warriors, not headline makers. My name was read second to last. I stood under soft lighting in a simple navy dress, hair pinned back, posture steady. No medals, no uniform, just me. And still, they clapped. Every single one of them. Some stood, some cried. None of them knew my father. None of them cared that he had once called me an embarrassment. They only knew what I had done, who I had become, who I always was when no one was looking. After the ceremony, a young girl approached me. 15, maybe 16. Shy. Hair tucked behind her ears. She hesitated at the edge of the aisle until I smiled. "You're Harper Wells," she said, like she'd been practicing it. "I am," I replied. "I want to be like you." I swallowed something that tasted like salt and sun. "Then be better," I told her. "Be kinder to yourself than I ever was." That night, I sat in my apartment with the windows open, the award beside a plant that had survived 2 moves and 3 near deaths. I made tea, wrote a note to Layla's mother, thanking her again for speaking up, and then I did something I never thought I would. I wrote my father a letter. Not out of longing, not for forgiveness, but for release. "Dad, I heard what you said at the gala. I also heard what you didn't say. For most of my life, I thought I needed your approval to breathe, to stand, to know who I was. But that night, when you refused to recognize me, something inside me stopped needing recognition. I know now I was never supposed to fit into your idea of success. I wasn't built to orbit around someone else's legacy. I was meant to build my own. You told people I embarrassed you, but you never asked why I chose to walk the path I did. You never wanted to know about the lives I touched, the children I protected, the weight I carried without thanks. So I'll tell you now, I didn't do it for you. I did it for the girls like me, the ones who were told to shrink, the ones you never saw. And I don't need you to see me anymore, because I see myself. Finally. Goodbye, Harper. I never mailed it. I didn't have to. Some letters are meant only for the air between you and the truth. I folded it once, clean and neat, and tucked it inside a book on my shelf, right next to a photo of myself in uniform, taken the day I returned from my final deployment. In that photo, I'm not smiling, but I'm standing tall, grounded, whole. I no longer attend family gatherings, not out of bitterness, but because some rooms are too small for who you've become. Connor eventually sent a short email, something about wishing he'd said something that night. I didn't reply. I hope he learns to speak up sooner for his daughter's sake, if not his own. My mother hasn't called again. I haven't deleted her voicemails. Maybe someday I will. Or maybe they'll sit there, quiet reminders of a love too late. I live a good life. Not a loud one, but one filled with meaning, real conversations, chosen family, students who challenge me, neighbors who wave, people who see me, not because they have to, but because they want to. And every year, on the anniversary of that gala, I write one line in my journal. I didn't flinch, because that was the moment everything changed. Not when the ambassador spoke, not when the room froze, but when I stood there, eyes forward, shoulders back, and refused to be small. They used to say I embarrassed the family. Now, they whisper about the night Harper Wells was honored by a diplomat on live television. They whisper, and I don't hear them because I've built a life too wide, too deep, and too true to ever be contained by whispers again.